And we're live. On today's show, we have the amazing Dan Parsons. For anybody who hasn't heard about the amazing, well, let's say Daniel Parsons. You got Daniel Parsons. Do you prefer Dan or Daniel?
I've got two pen names. One is Dan, one's Daniel. So this is my fiction pen name, but my non-fiction is Dan. So you know me as both.
Yeah. So Dan stroke Daniel. For the people who have not yet heard of you, the 2% of the world, would you describe what kind of books you write and what other stuff you do?
So I write, well, a mixture. Under my fiction pen name, which is Daniel Parsons, as I just mentioned, I do sort of middle grade fantasy and comedy zombie stuff. And then under my non-fiction pen name, I do sort of guides for authors and creators who want to get into the creator economy. And yeah, I'm also the content production manager for the Alliance of Independent Authors, and I blog weekly for Mark Dawson's self-publishing formula. So quite busy at the moment.
Yeah. Okay. Well, shall we get onto your book picks? And so I'm going to try out my new transition, and it depends if I get bored with this or not quickly. Right. And your first book pick is Eragon by Christopher Paolini. So why did you pick this book?
I picked this book. I'll just sort of flash the covers up of the books that I've got here with me. I picked this book just because it was one of the early books I know that I read quite young, and it sort of inspired me to be an author. So I don't know if you're familiar with the Inheritance Cycle, which is the 4-book series, but they were actually quite big and pivotal for inspiring me to get into fantasy in the first place. Ooh. So when I first started writing stories and things as a teenager, that was generally the direction I was going in. I was going to be a hardcore, Brandon Sanderson type author. And then obviously, as you know, as your career develops and you find different markets and things, everything sort of spirals off into different tangents. But yeah, this book is fantastic. It's sort of, I wouldn't say it's particularly original in terms of other epic fantasy, sets in a fantasy world, much like Lord of the Rings and stuff. But it is a very, very good example of what you can do within the genre. So there's the classic young farm boy, is the epitome of good, finds a dragon, and then they go on adventures and they have to fight a dark lord, and that's the sort of premise for the whole series. But yeah, it's just an extremely good example of what it is. And I think what inspired me quite a lot by it is the author, Christopher Paolini. He started writing this book, I believe, when he was 15, which, considering the sort of thickness of the book, is quite a weighty tome. And it's got, thousands of reviews on Amazon and stuff. So as a 15-year-old, he's done quite well. And he sort of carried his career through to selling millions, and he's obviously he was a big example to me because I would have been just behind him in the timeline.
Oh, okay. So that was your first inspiration, right?
I definitely didn't follow his trajectory, though, of selling millions.
You didn't have a book out by 15? I don't know.
I didn't know. I took until 20.
You slapped it down. Right. So let's go on to your. This probably involves too much work, but let's try it anyway. And your next book is The Warlock of Firetop Mountain by Steve Jackson and Ian Livingstone. Which is this a choose your own adventure book?
It is, and that's why I ironically chose it for this for this podcast. It's because it's something that's very different. So I've got a box set here. These again were something that I encountered when I was very, very young.
Yeah.
And there were loads of them in the series, but I'd not encountered something that was structured quite like this until that age. And I don't think they're even as popular anymore. So yeah, I thought it was a little bit of a curveball to talk about with your audience, because the premise of it is essentially you're a character who wakes up in a fantasy world. You don't always know what you are at the beginning of the story, but you could be an elf or a troll or a human or whatever. You then go on an adventure, or you're mid-adventure, and you have an objective. So you're essentially playing what would be a sort of Dungeons and Dragons type board game, but in book form, where every time you need to roll the dice, you flick through the pages and the dice are at the bottom of the pages. And you can take alternate adventures where it all goes off in different tangents and you flip back and forth through passages in the book. So yeah, it's a really, to me, it was a very original idea at the time. And when you're sort of playing with form and trying to work out what sort of writer you want to be, it's quite a fun exercise to create one of these. And obviously they would have set a standard for the types of video games and stuff that developed as a result of this. So yeah, I just thought it was a really interesting form. And obviously, when we go through some of the other books I've chosen, they've been chosen for similar reasons. The fact that they do something different and interesting, because it's always fun when you find something that's different, but in a way that still grabs you, because not all award-winning, completely off-the-wall books do grab you, and this is a fun way to introduce children to a new form.
Yeah, I suppose they've been taken over by like computer game, adventure games and the like, even though adventure games are now dead, but more RPG and sort of more, because you don't, I mean, it must have been a real phenomenal effort to write a book like this, to do all of the combinations, because...
yeah, I imagine it would be done with lots and lots of Post-it notes and pieces of string and all that type of stuff, because I don't really know how you'd structure it just by going through one by one. But yeah, I can imagine it's done sort of that way. Or, you know, these days it would be done on something like Plotter, which is a software version of having sticky notes everywhere. But yeah, I can imagine it'll be more popular potentially when it comes to things like the metaverse, when we eventually get into that, because you can map out entire virtual walls in front of you, and I think plotting will become a very different thing then. So yeah, we'll see how that goes in a few years, but you never know, we may all be writing in this form within 5 to 10 years when Facebook rules the world.
Okay. And the next book is The Colour of Magic by Terry Pratchett. And
okay, yeah. So this is The Colour of Magic by Terry Pratchett. It's the first book in the Discworld series. So this is, I think, by the end of when he finished writing them, they were about 45-ish in the Discworld series. And what they are essentially is they're the Marvel Cinematic Universe of fantasy in fiction before Marvel was outside of comics. So yeah, they are a series of books that follow the Night's Watch, who are essentially medieval police officers in this fantasy world. And then there are some other books in the series that follow Rincewind the Wizard, and there are children's spin-offs like the Wee Free Men and stuff. And it's this really interesting, probably early on one of the first of its kind. It's a big world where all of the books sort of morph into one another, and characters offshoot into different directions, and some of them overlap between different books. And what I like about it is that not only is it really interesting and did something at the time that it came out that other books didn't do, but it's also done really well. Pratchett is one of the few authors that has made me laugh out loud on a bus, because his things that he writes are really, really funny. And there are also moments where the characters say things that are really profound and deep, and he talks about society and human nature and things like that. And I don't think it's often that you run into a book or a series of books that actually go into that much depth and have that much complexity while also being funny.
Yeah. We actually have a comment on Amazon, which I can't put up on here because of the technical limitations of Amazon Live, but from Amazon customer, the picture does look familiar, so maybe it's somebody I already know. I wonder if you could integrate your Choose Your Own Adventure feed with a website or Twitter feed. So yeah, I suppose there's all sorts of ideas. Twitter could be a very good Choose Your Own
Twitter could work, actually, if you could link between different pages for different tweets. You could sort of, that sounds like a logistical nightmare to me, but someone would do it.
That would be the rest of your life, basically.
Also, you'd have to write it backwards for the links to link back to each other.
Okay, well, maybe forget about that idea. And the next book is The House of Silk by Anthony Horowitz.
Yeah, so Anthony Horowitz is still a big name these days. He's been a big name for about 2 or 3 decades now. So he originally became very successful with the Alex Rider series, which is a series of teenage James Bond type books. And they're all about, this teenage boy with gadgets and things. But this was actually, he for a very brief period of time, and actually possibly still now, maybe I just lost track, he was officially commissioned by the Arthur Conan Doyle estate to take over the Sherlock Holmes books, which are these ones. and also the James Bond books. So it's a bit of a career. So he was simultaneously the face of James Bond and Sherlock Holmes, which is unusual for an author. But yeah, I just really like this because it has the feel of some of the older Sherlock Holmes books. You know, the Victorian way of writing and you know, sentence structure and all that. And I love the world in which all of that sort of partakes. But also, it's got a sort of modern twist, and there are certainly different themes that you may not have seen in the original books. It just moves, it sort of weaves into the original canon books really, really well. And I chose it purely because I think Anthony Horowitz is a very good example of an author who's a bit of a chameleon. So if you look at one of his series compared to another of his series, they're often you can tell that they're commercially driven in a way that is very characteristically him, but they are also extremely different in terms of tone and voice. So he can copy the voices of other authors, which obviously is why he would have been chosen for different franchises and stuff. He's very, very good. And yeah, this is a very good example of what Sherlock Holmes should be in the modern world.
So if there was any particular franchise that you could take over writing, which one would you pick then, Dan?
I mean, that's a curveball. I mean, everyone would love a stab at a Marvel movie, I think. I'm not sure my Marvel movie would be any good because I think I'd go a bit Tim Burton with it, which would be totally off-brand for them. But, you know, everyone would love to sort of take things that are fluffy and light and make them dark and do different things with them that, you know, some slightly off-color jokes that Marvel are not used to. And I think I did really like, recently there was I think it was a Amazon Prime TV show where they were, I can't remember what it's called now, superheroes anyway, and it's the dark side.
Oh, The Boys. Is it Boys?
Yeah, The Boys, yeah. So I feel like that's probably the angle that I would have gone down if I'd taken over the MCU and wrote a script for that. But yeah, obviously it's already been done, and they've done it very well.
Yeah, okay. And the next book is The Silence of the Lambs by Thomas Harris.
Yeah, so I actually encountered this book. I was forced to read it when I was in university because I did a crime fiction module. I did an English literature degree in Cardiff Uni near me. And yeah, this was one of the books on the curriculum. And it turned out to be my favourite book that I wrote. I wish I wrote it, that I ever read in an education setting. So yeah, it's an extremely good example of a thriller. And it's quite good in that there isn't one villain per se, so you're not entirely sure what's going to go on. For anyone who's unfamiliar with the plot, essentially there is a serial killer on the loose called Buffalo Bill, who you know, takes people's skin and does things, you know, abducts women and things like that. So the main character, who's a detective, she has to go to a different serial killer who's locked up, who is the famous Hannibal, and then she has to use his mind to try and catch another serial killer. And it's just a really, really, to me, it was extremely gripping. It's, I think, a good example of a modern page turner, which, as much as a lot of people say page turners are not as worthy as sort of award-winning literary fiction, I think if you set out to write a page turner and it's very good at that, you've actually done a really good job. So yeah, Silence of the Lambs, I think the tone and the dialogue and everything's sort of very, very creepy. And as someone who's now sort of dabbling with the idea of writing my own thriller, this will be the template that I'm going to be looking at to try and you know, influence my own writing in that genre. Yeah. If you find an example of something that's very, very good at what it does, then obviously use that example to inform your own writing.
Yeah. Or Dan Holloway, who also works for Ally, he actually chose Hannibal as one of his books. So,
okay.
So it's a bit of descent there in Ally. So that's which book to go for. Yeah. And the next book is Life of Pi by Jan Martel.
Yeah, so I really enjoyed this book. For anyone who doesn't know, it's about a boy called Pi who falls off a boat when he's traveling with his parents. He's on sort of a cargo ship with lots of animals and stuff, and then ends up trying to survive in a dinghy with an adult tiger, and he's a sort of teenage boy. The entire thing is metaphorical, and I like this book because it's the first book that I got to the end, and I had to Google whether or not I understood the ending, because it's extremely interesting, and you can sort of interpret different scenes in different ways depending on the way you read it. So yeah, I think it won a Booker Prize or something, and for very good reason, because it is extremely good. But yeah, you can read it as a story in its own right, but also there's the layers upon layers of metaphors, and it's actually quite an educated story in terms of a lot of the characters that are talked about in flashbacks and the early chapters are all quite educated, and it flows quite nicely while also giving you this sense that you're reading something worthwhile. And yeah, I just sort of really enjoyed all the different layers of complexity that come with this book. But that's not to say that it's slow, because like I said, this is actually a page turner in a similar way to if anyone's read The Martian, which isn't on my list today, but it should be. It's one of those books that is very heavy in, this one is heavy in sort of religion and theology type stuff, in the same way that The Martian is quite heavy in science, while still being a really quick page turner that you just sort of fall through.
Yeah, I know. It's one of the few books I've actually read. The book chat show, but and it's also one where a book is so much better than the film.
Oh yeah, 100%. Yeah,
but because of the nature of the book and the things the book does, it's so hard to make a film from it. So,
yeah, you can't really explore metaphors in the same way on screen that you can through a book.
No.
So yeah, I think this is an example where the book is always going to be better than the film. I know that's the case with most books, and some more than others. But yeah, this is always a really strong one.
Well, you do get some films where the film is genuinely better than the book, but that's where it's kind of taken the book as inspiration, I think, more than anything. And the book itself wasn't that good. He just had a good idea. Right. And the next one is another well-known book, which I haven't read, actually. I've seen the film, but I haven't read this book. So The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown.
You may be the only person in the world who hasn't read this book. So yeah, The Da Vinci Code by Dan Brown. Basically, this is about a symbologist who works for Harvard University, who gets essentially wrapped up in criminal mastermind type escapades. But often they have a historical theme and they're tied to the church. And it involves a lot of heavy wading through conspiracy theories and things like that in order to get to a particular outcome. But these books, the entire series, are actually very, very action-packed. And I like the way that the chapters are about 2 pages each, because you never end up at a point where you think, I'll leave the book for now because it's got a 30-page chapter coming up. You can't stop. It's one of those books that you keep reading and reading, and then it's 2 a.m. and you're thinking, oh my God, I've got stuff to do tomorrow. So yeah, I'm not a book snob in any way. So I know obviously anything that's very popular, people tend to hate on. And I find that things that are very popular are popular for a reason. And yeah, whether or not all of the facts in this book are true, I wouldn't know, because I haven't bothered to Google every single thing on every page. But yeah, it is a very, very good thriller that will sort of take you through the story quite quickly. And in the same way that Lee Child is quite formulaic, I think that these books are also quite formulaic, but they're just so original compared to everything else that's around them. And I think people have tried to copy them now, but it can't be executed in the same way that Dan Brown does it. So yeah, I just think that there isn't really an alternative to the Da Vinci Code that you could say matches it.
Yeah. So you're going to write a book now, the Michelangelo Code, and slavishly copy it.
With a cannibal involved, and
we have another comment from it's actually Catherine C. Lang, who from Twitter. I don't know if you know from Twitter. But she said, my goal is to write a book that is a page-turning award winner that everybody wants to make into a TV and movie series. And she also hasn't read the Da Vinci Code.
Okay. I think she just described Stephen King's career. Because he wins awards, sells lots of page-turners, and has all the TV shows.
Yeah.
I think I read somewhere actually he's the most adapted author
Yeah.
of all time, and he's got something like 80 odd film and TV credits, which is crazy.
I know, it's phenomenal. Anyway, let's go on to the next one. I almost put the wrong one up there, which is The Curious Incident of the Dog at Nighttime by Mark Haddon.
Yeah, so this book, actually, I think I got it free as a World Book Day book one year. And it was, thoroughly an enjoyable read. It's one of these things that I think it's originally sort of aimed at teenagers, but it's universally loved by every adult that reads it. They are the odd, there's the odd word in there that couldn't be repeated on a family podcast.
Yeah.
But that's because the main character is a 15-year-old boy with autism, and he recalls conversations that he encounters with extreme accuracy, no matter what the people say. And it's all about how he finds a dog in a garden, in a neighbor's garden, with a pitchfork stuck in it, and then tries to go on an adventure to discover who killed the dog and sort of what happened in terms of the context of it. And yeah, it's just such an original voice. And I like it because it's probably on a theme that I wouldn't normally read, and from a perspective of a character that you don't see very often. And it's an example of something that I definitely don't know if I could write myself, because I'd have to put so much research into this.
Yeah.
Which is partly why I write fantasy, because I think I started out with fantasy because I wasn't particularly well traveled. So I didn't have sort of travel adventures I could talk about. And if you write fantasy, you don't have to do any research.
Yeah, but you have to do world building fantasies. I discovered when I tried writing fantasy, and then
yeah. So I didn't world build early on, and then I discovered this with magic systems and things like that.
People will remember what somebody could do in book 1 when you get to book 6 or
whatever. Otherwise, you end up with Deus Ex Machinas that never made sense from the beginning and all that type of stuff, as I've discovered in my career and gone back and re-edited books.
Yeah. Right. And the next book is World War Z, An Oral History of the Zombie War by Max Brooks.
Yeah, I wish I could hold this book up, because it is one of the best books I've ever read, in my opinion.
Yeah.
You'll probably see it on the shelf behind me, and I just couldn't find it. So yeah, if you haven't read it, it's essentially, I think it's described as an oral history of the zombie war. And essentially there's a main character that runs through it, but tangentially, so he doesn't really show up in the story quite a lot. He is a journalist who is interviewing different people from the start to the later stages of a zombie war, where there's the early breakout, I think started in China and now mirrors the real world, I've just realized, and sort of spreads across the world, and there's lots of drama and big outbreaks. I think there's a battle scene in New York and all that type of stuff in the book. This is an example where I would say the book is definitely better than the film, because I know you mentioned that earlier, because I think the film, what they did was they took the name from the book and then didn't use any of the content, and they just sort of simplified it, because the book would have such a massive cast, and it'd be so complex and long that it wouldn't really fit together as a film. But yeah, I absolutely love that book, because every single chapter has a different character's perspective, where they're being interviewed about the different stage they were at in the zombie war when their interest in events sort of kicked off. So there's anyone from doctors to soldiers to medics and all these different types of people, and it's such a varied book, and all of the stories are so strong and the different characters are so vivid that I think, regardless of whether or not you like horror, as long as you can stomach a little bit of horror and gore, you'll probably like this book, because it's so varied and original.
Yeah, it's funny. I always used to think I didn't like horror, but as I've got older, I've been started to encounter it more, and I'm like, well, that's not too bad. I don't mind somebody's head flying off or whatever.
Yeah, do you know what I've actually discovered is, because I've never been great with horror films in particular. I actually went to see Ghost Stories, which is the Martin Freeman one, a few years ago with a few friends, and I didn't realize it was that bad of a horror until I arrived at the cinema. and there was one point where I yelped and a family behind me laughed. I'm just not good at horror. But yeah, what I've realized is that as long as you stay around to encounter the monster, it becomes less scary. I think it's the thought of the scary thing is worse than encountering it. Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, in a similar vein, so I write zombie stuff, as we'll sort of talk about later. And it's very similar to you, where you discovered that it's actually not that bad. I never used to write horror, and then I was given a horror writing exercise when I was in university, and now I write zombie books. So it's it's one of those things that you find when you encounter it, it's actually more fun than you think it's going to be.
Right. And the next book is 1984 by George Orwell. Did I spell that right? I think I did. Yeah.
Yeah. So I hesitate to say I've read this book because I definitely have, but I'm aware that it was once named on QI as the #1 most popular book that people lie about having read. So I've definitely actually read it. But yeah, it's essentially about a dystopian world where the government sort of controls all of the media and rewrites media articles through history, sets up fake wars with foreign lands and things like that so that they control the population to the point where they have these entities called thought police that, video members of the population and things. It's a really... It's a book that couldn't be written again because it's one of those things where the idea is so strong and original that even if you wrote it in a different way, it would just be a carbon copy of the example of the book. But yeah, it's a really, really good, well thought out idea. And I know obviously similarly to this, Animal Farm is a different take on breakdowns in society and class systems and things like that. But this one I think is really, really interesting because of the potential for it to be copied in real life. And whether or not it will be copied in real life, I'm not sure, but we'll see how that goes.
Yeah, some people would argue it already has been, but that's a whole other matter. Actually, to defeat the object of anybody buying this on Amazon, but Audible, this is free on Audible with Animal Farm, with because I listened to it recently.
Okay.
Like Stephen Fry narrates it, Animal Farm, and then 1984. So if you want to refresh your knowledge of the book, you can listen to it on Audible.
Seamlessly ties in with my QI anecdote then.
Oh, you got a QI anecdote.
Well, the fact that they said about it was the most lied about book, and it's also narrated by Stephen Fry.
yeah, probably. Maybe he's trying to tell us something there. And the next book is Dracula by Bram Stoker.
Yeah, so again, more horror. But I think it's you don't really need to explain the premise of Dracula because I think everyone knows what Dracula is, who Dracula is. What I like about it though is that there's so much more to the book than I originally realized, because there are lots and lots of metaphors, and certain characters are archetypes of personality disorders, and it's from an author perspective, it's really, really interesting because you can look into it and you find out that all of the different characters have, psychopathic traits and different issues to do with their identities that wouldn't have been explored before Dracula. So yeah, it's just really, really interesting, and it's a bit of a commentary on what people thought at the time that is now not necessarily as politically correct regarding women's rights and mental states and abilities and things like that. So it doesn't really age very well, but it's still very interesting.
Yeah, I remember reading it on Kindle, on my phone actually, on Kindle. It must be 10 years ago or something now. It's depressing, but I was thinking this is tremendously sexist. This wouldn't be allowed.
Oh, absolutely, yeah. But if you can read it and sort of put your modern perspective aside, it's actually a really interesting book. And some of the main characters are actually not talked about very often in popular culture outside of the core text. So there's a character whose name I can't remember now, Renfield or something like that. It was a while ago I read the book, much like you. But But yeah, he is locked up in a prison and is eating animals and is visited by Dracula quite often. And that's when I first discovered there's a condition called zoophagy, which is when people believe that if they eat living organisms, they absorb their life force. And it's a real medical condition. And there's all these little sort of tidbits that you can take from fiction, and you think I can use these elements in similar ways. And I just thought it was really interesting.
So it's a good book from a writer's perspective, really, because to see all the stuff he does with mental health, maybe intentionally, maybe not intentionally.
Yeah, I think he was a smart guy, so it was probably intentional. But yeah, it's really good, sort of allegorically with all of that type of stuff.
Right. And the next one is A Clockwork Orange by Anthony Burgess, which I've seen the film, but I haven't read the book.
Yeah, so the book, which is about a 15-year-old boy called Alex, is possibly one of the hardest books I've ever had to read, because it's very, very short. So it's about 100 pages, I think. It's not very long at all. Yeah. But it's essentially written in code, where all of the characters, if you've seen the film, I actually haven't seen the film. So I assume that they all speak in a way that doesn't really make sense in normal language. And it's very similar within the book. And even the characters' thoughts and stuff are all written in that way. The issue that I had with it is that it doesn't explain the sort of lexicon that they use early on. You've got to pick it up as you go. So it's a bit like reading, Chaucer or something, where you pick up what the words mean through context, and then by the end of the book, just as you're getting used to it, it finishes. So it's a bit useless to you as soon as you get to a point where you can understand everything. But it is really, really interesting. And the idea of using milk instead of alcohol and ultraviolence, and the characters are all really interesting. The ideas explored in there are very original. So yeah, I thought for a book that is, like I said, about 100 pages, it actually does a lot, considering how much content is actually there. And it would be something that would be quite fun as an exercise to try out as well. It's really good in terms of original voices. So if you wanted to, replicate these types of things, then yeah, this is a really good example of something you might want to look at.
Okay. And the next book is one I've also read, The 4-Hour Workweek by Tim Ferriss.
Yeah, so you know how they sometimes say that people are really susceptible to being sold to, and they just buy anything that's sort of flashy? Well, I'm like that, but with self-help. So I love self-help stuff. I just absorb podcasts and YouTube videos and books in the same way. And The 4-Hour Workweek is probably one of the most influential bits of self-help that I've ever consumed. So the idea stems around Tim Ferriss, who's the guy who wrote the book and has got a really, really popular podcast himself as well. So he used to run a company that did very, very well. And then he was offered to be bought out by some investors. They challenged him to remove himself from the company so that everything ran totally without him. And then he did that. He spent, I think it was 6 months or a year, working out how to get everything outsourced, and so everything connects and works without him, and he just made money autonomously. And then they decided not to buy his company, which is great for him, because then his company was completely on its own. And he just sort of explains how all of the pieces connect together. And to me, this was my first sort of foray into the idea of passive income. So I know it's not really literature in the traditional sense of, a novel. But yeah, I just thought that the ideas in the 4-Hour Workweek were really interesting, and made me look at the world very differently. It's great from a creator's perspective, as you'll know, with all different income streams and the way that you can set things up, and then they run on their own and you can go off and do other fun things. Yeah,
well, I mean, personally, I thought I might have even read it while I was still working. Well, working as an employment sense, I'm not like but I think it's profound because it is that encouragement for people that pathway for people in employment to minimize their time until they're doing like 4 hours a week. You do hear apocryphal stories of like somebody who hired some VA to do all his work and actually wasn't doing the work.
Yeah,
and they
yeah.
didn't notice for years. But like he was paying this other guy cheap money somewhere in the Far East to do his job, do most of his job, and he was getting paid his salary, and he was doing other stuff.
Oh yeah.
So,
Likewise, I've actually heard of a programmer, a friend of a friend who worked from home and managed to write code that could essentially do all of the data entry admin that he was paid to do. So it was done autonomously. He just sort of started it up in the morning, and then he would just do his job, and he could sit around. So yeah, I think it's very, very possible, and the potential for those sorts of ideas is quite exciting.
Yeah. Okay. The next book is The Money Master. Money Master the Game by Tony Robbins. That's a weird title. Did I misspell that? Not sure.
No, it is Money Master the Game, and it is absolutely massive. So it's about 700 pages, I think. It's a real sort of doorstop of a book. This is something that I read on the train in the same vein as this one, where I was sort of trying to leave the day job at the time, and I wanted to build up income streams and stuff. But this one is exclusively about investing. And in the book, Tony Robbins, who is a very famous in America self-help guru and personal development expert, he has access to lots of billionaires and very intelligent people who dominate money markets and things as a result of the coaching that he gives them. And in order to write this book, he actually interviewed all of the biggest experts that he knew in the world. So, the people who run huge hedge funds worth trillions and all this type of stuff, and breaks it down into what he calls 7 simple steps to financial freedom. Now, when each of those steps is about 100 pages each, I'm not sure it's simple. There's a lot of sort of very complicated math behind it. But if you go through it and just take out the basic principles of what he teaches you, I actually used this system throughout the early stages of the pandemic and managed to make some money and stuff using it. So I just thought it's a way to prime yourself to make money when other people think that you can't. I just found it extremely interesting and useful.
Yeah. You're not going to suddenly appear with an advert on your chest or something. It's like, I've sold this little bit of this show to.
I don't want to say, and now I'm earning 20,000 a day and all this type of stuff. No, it's not like that. It's more of a building gradually over your lifetime thing. But yeah, it is one of those things that if you invest when the markets are down, to use financial terms, you can make money a lot faster. And this is just, this book showed me exactly sort of how to do that. You've just got to be prepared to invest 700 pages of your focus to get there.
Well, that's true with a lot of things, isn't it? Okay. And this is a book by this amazing Dan Parsons author, The Winter Freak Show.
Yeah, I don't know about the author himself. He sounds like a bit of a weirdo, but the book is really good. Yeah, so this is one of my books. It's called The Winter Freak Show, and it's actually the first book that I published myself when I was in my 3rd year of university. So originally I was one of these authors who was going for a traditional publishing deal. I was shopping around a manuscript with agents and all that. And while I was waiting for them to, miraculously publish my first manuscript, I decided to write a side book and use it as a way to build my author CV to show that I was selling some copies. And in doing so, I actually wrote this book, which is essentially Oliver Twist meets Fantastic Beasts. So it's about a small orphan boy who leaves an orphanage, slightly abusive upbringing, moves into the city of London in Victorian London, almost freezes to death because it's midwinter, because this is a Christmas-based book, and he gets picked up by a traveling circus that turns out is run by Father Christmas, and it's the start of a trilogy where there are recurring monsters and people coming from abroad, and it's all German fairy tale characters and things like that. So if you look at the Twisted, typically it's German and Scandinavian. So German and Scandinavian monsters from Christmas folklore are the primary villains that are sort of cropping up in all of the books, and it sort of culminates in this big what I think has turned into a bit of a universe where I'm considering offshoots and things. It was a lot more fun to write than I expected, and it did turn into a 150,000 word trilogy when it was supposed to be a little side project. So it was a lot of fun to write.
Okay, so let's go on to the next book, which is The Last Crawl by Dan Parsons. So it's the same author.
It is, yeah. I've taken the opportunity to throw in a few of my books at the end.
Oh, no, that's part of the point of this show, really.
So yeah, this one, which is designed by a cover designer who actually used to sit next to me in an office, because I used to work for a traditional publisher. So my designer was the designer for the traditional publisher. She also did that cover as well, so she's very good. But yeah, this book essentially is a Shaun of the Dead / Zombieland type horror comedy. The premise of it, though, I think is quite original, because it's about the first night in university, which for American listeners of the podcast, we refer to as freshers, which lasts about 2 weeks. And during that 2 weeks, there's a big sort of university party every night, and students get very drunk and all that. So the idea behind this book is that there's a zombie outbreak on the campus of the university during the freshers parties. All of the students are getting drunk, and they think that the people who are attacking them are drunk or students on drugs. What they discover, though, that early on, obviously, this is a real zombie attack, and the numbers are multiplying quickly, and they figure out that the only way not to be attacked is to get extremely drunk, because the zombies don't notice you if you're very, very drunk, to the point of almost blackout. So the objective of the main characters who band together on the first night that they've met each other is to get so drunk that they can barely stand, but not so drunk that they pass out, so that they can escape the campus. And there's lots of tongue-in-cheek jokes and hijinks, and people who are sort of bringing zombies with them on nights out and things like that.
So it's really comedy zombie fiction then, isn't it?
There will be another one of these coming out soon called Beach Bodies, which is similar sort of premise, but it's on a party Ibiza type island where a zombie outbreak happens, and it's so it's going to be a 3 or 4 book series, I think. But it's what I tend to do when I write these books is I come up with a premise that I think is funny, and then I wrap the entire book around that central idea. I'm not really a character author. I'm more of a high concept.
No, I'm similar. Well, I can't write decent characters. It's more problem. And your last book is also by this Dan Parsons. I think is it Daniel Parsons, this book? And
this one is Dan Parsons. The others were Daniel Parsons.
Oh, okay. I was like,
that's okay.
My system can't cope with different names. Different pen names.
To make it even more confusing, the first book in this series has both pen names on there, because I was mid-transition into the other pen name. I can understand why anyone would be confused. So this is a book I wrote called Networking for Authors, and it's all about how to build your own network as a new writer who wants to get into publishing. So it's about building a business in the way that an author traditionally should, in the modern sense. So possibly not applying to publishers and hoping you get picked up, but creating your own publishing network of contacts around you so that you can build your own business and empower yourself, which I think you're an advocate for that sort of lifestyle as well. Being sort of in the trenches of Ally.
I've written a very similar book, not meaning to. So, and that's Tim Lewis, and fiction books are Timothy Michael Lewis. So I've got the same problem. Same problem you have with
I think the thing with us is that we're multi-passionate, I think is the word that Joanna Penn uses, where you end up having different interests and you can't quite stick to one. But this is the idea behind this is it's good for introverts just because it talks about social media much like your book. I think possibly the difference with mine is that it also talks about strategies at physical networking events like conferences and stuff as well.
Oh yeah.
So I think there is enough room for people to read both of our books.
Right. So the next thing we have, thankfully, that is the end of the book transition graphic, which I'm sure everybody's come to.
You did very well.
But we now have a new graphic, the Dream Amazon pick. And for the long-time viewers of this show, or one or two of them, every show I ask the author for an item they would buy on Amazon.com if money was no object. So, and this is where I have to go share screen. Anyway, this was the item you picked, which is a well, actually, I think I picked this for you, to be honest. But this represents.
We'll call it a token.
So tell the audience what this represents.
Okay, so this is a very expensive train set, and it's not that I necessarily want a very expensive train set. What I really wanted that I couldn't find at the time was a ticket to the Orient Express, which would probably be this expensive or more, considering I think it would be the equivalent of a 2-week vacation. So yeah, I've always quite liked traveling on trains. I find it quite relaxing, especially if there's a desk in front of me. And I always found that I did my best writing while traveling on the railway. So what I would love to do, because I am a fan of Agatha Christie's work, is I'd love to be able to write a book on the Orient Express, which is about the most famous book, or the most famous book is about that, you know. So I just thought it'd be a really interesting idea. Plus, you get to explore quite a lot of countries being on there. So it'd be sort of a twofer for me, where I get to do a lot of traveling and tick lots of countries off my list, because I quite like to do that. But at the same time, I'd be extremely productive because I'm traveling by railway on the downtime. So you've got the great view, you get to do all the traveling and get loads of work done. So you may actually pay for the ticket by the time you get off the train by having published a bestseller.
Well, I think you would need to have like published it and promoted it while on the train. It would be a one long train ride.
You underestimate me.
Rapid release on the train. That actually sounds like a challenge, doesn't it? Like write a book while on the train.
I'm sure there are some authors in the community who could do that. Some of the really quick ones.
Right. So, well, that didn't work particularly well. The whole screen sharing thing. I think it's because I switched to my I realized that my inbuilt webcam on my computer is actually better than my external one. So this show, and I think when I went to screen share, it just went all. So it'd be interesting to see the replay and see what I look like. So I've switched to my external webcam, which is I thought was cutting edge, but actually I think I bought it in about the year 2010. So I think it's worse than the built-in one on my computer. So what I like to do at the end is let's talk a bit about your books in general. So what is your plan next book? I mean, what series have you got that are still outstanding and unfinished, so to speak?
Okay, so it's probably easier to say which ones I have finished, because I've got quite a few open series. So yeah, the Twisted Christmas trilogy, which that's the book one, that one is finished and completely wrapped up, and I got my first box set out of it, which was quite exciting. However, I've got the comedy zombie ones, which are called the Necroville series. So as I mentioned, Beach Bodies will hopefully be out sometime late this year. I've also got quite a new book, actually, that isn't on pre-order yet, but it will be soon, called Write a Book, which it's in the Creative Business series, which I've also mentioned. And the premise of that book essentially is for every person who has tried to write a book and not quite got as far as they'd like to, and they've not finished it. It's all about building a system that gives you a sustainable writing practice so that you can get all the way to the end and then edit and publish. Because I don't know about you, but the first book that I published wasn't the first book that I wrote. There were lots of failed attempts. I mentioned actually the one before it that I was shopping around to agents. That one never got published either, despite being finished, because I didn't think it was good enough. It was just the first one I finished. Before that, I think I had 5 other books that I didn't get to the end. So yeah, when I did get to the end, it completely changed my mindset, and I was able to do it again and again and again. So yeah, this book is all about not having to go through a trial period of 6 books before you get one that succeeds. So you can jump straight on to finishing the first one you try.
So are you a pantser or a plotter then? Anybody who's listening to this who doesn't know what that means somebody who plans out their book beforehand is a planner, and a pantser writes for the seat of their pants and makes up as they go along. What level are you with that?
I think I used to be quite a loose plotter. So I've always plotted to some degree. It used to be, a sentence per chapter or something. But now I've become more and more of an extreme plotter, to the point where I'm almost a pantser, because I'm practically writing a first draft as a plan.
I suppose that's true, isn't it? Like, if you go so far, you actually become.
Yeah, you go completely the other way. But yeah, so like right now, I've got a thriller in the works that I mentioned, and with that, I think my plan was 8,000 words, and the book itself will be about 90,000. So you're looking at about 8 or 9% of the book is written in notes before I start. But yeah, I just find it much easier because I will edit my plan before I start writing the book, so that I don't have to write myself into corners on the first draft and go back and edit, 50,000 words or something. I can just do it in 5,000. It just makes it a lot easier for me.
Well, that was how I wrote my first. I actually got to finishing my first book, was because I learned about this idea of planning. And before then, I'd always end up writing, and then I'd end up like, I've no idea what happens now. What can you do? And that's where having a plan helps, because you can. It's not so much because the start. There's always this rewriting element. Otherwise, you have to keep going back and trying to work out what you did and change this here. When if it's just paragraphs, it's easier to do.
I mean, I similarly to you, where you sort of run out of steam and go, I don't know what comes next. I found myself, I got trapped in a spiral for a few books because I was reading things like Pratchett, where he's very deep and talks about society and stuff. I ended up getting to the point where these fantasy characters I was writing had to solve the meaning of life in order for me to finish the book. And I couldn't answer that. So I just couldn't finish the book.
Okay. So is there a book that you've got in you that you haven't written yet that you want to write? Is there like you don't feel ready, but at some point you'll write this magnus opus? Is it magnus opus? Like this book that's like kind of the thing that you want to write, but you're not. Is there anything that you've got in you that you want to write, but you don't feel ready for writing it yet?
I mean, not necessarily ready, because not that I'm a great writer. It's just I run into projects with blind optimism, regardless of whether or not it turns out good. But there are lots of projects that I quite like to write that I just don't have the time to write because they don't fit my already existing brands, because I'm already spread so thinly across different series. I don't want to start another one. So I'd quite like to do some whodunits, because, the Poirot type, I mentioned Agatha Christie with the Orient Express and things like that. So those ones are quite interesting, but I'd like to do them from the perspective of the murderers, where instead of the main characters trying to work out who's killed the person, you start with the murderer, and then the murderer is trying to cover their tracks throughout the entire book, where the detective is just a sort of, they're off on the side and you don't know what they're doing the entire time, to the point where I think the villain, which would be my main character, would probably be making it worse by adding plot, things in that is going to incriminate them even more. So I quite like that idea. It's just I can't do all of my ideas, because probably you have so many different ideas and you think I'm never going to get around to all of these.
No, that's definitely a problem. We've got a comment from Catherine Seelang, which is, I read somewhere that to building a living wage as an author, you need to have 7 books in one genre. Do you find that holds true? So
I mean, yes and no. That's probably an average. I would find. There are some authors that work in very commercial genres. So if you work in sort of contemporary romance, I know of authors who've managed to get a full-time living off sort of 2 or 3 books. Not many people do it with one. I think it's very unusual to do it with one. But yeah, there are some people that manage to do it with 2 or 3. I think for the people that I know that are very successful, they usually start seeing meaningful money coming in at around 5 books in the same genre.
Yeah.
My problem is that I work in about 4 different genres.
Well,
So I have got to the
3. So.
Yeah, I have got to the point where my books sort of make money, and I've got other freelance income streams and things like that to supplement it. But yeah, it certainly would be easier if you stuck to one genre. I think once you get to about 20 books, though, even if they're in different genres, you've got a good chance of potentially making reasonable money anyway. So you don't have to stick to one genre. It just really helps, especially if the genre is commercial.
Yeah. Right. I'm going to ask you which. Well, no, I'm not going to say the expression I was because it's an Amazon family show. But if you like civilization depended on you picking one of these books to give to somebody on a desert island, I don't know why civilization would depend on it, but basically, which of these books would be the one that you would give somebody if it was like you're only allowed to give them one of these books? Which one would it be?
I mean, I'm not sure how much they'd appreciate this being alone on a desert island, but possibly the World War Z one, just because there are so many survival tactics involved from so many different perspectives.
Oh, yeah, that's true.
So yeah, there are soldiers and doctors and all these types of people in the books that explain what they've done to survive. And I actually, at one point, had quite a lot of fun, weirdly, trying to work out my zombie survival tactics, which I don't think is too dissimilar from, being on a desert island after a few months where you sort of have to detach from civilization anyway. So yeah, I think it'd actually be quite a useful book for people on a desert island.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I don't think there's much of a risk of zombies. Well, there might be. You don't know. Maybe it's like that's why.
Depends on the island.
Yeah, exactly. Well, anyway, it's been great to have you on the show. I try and keep it to about an hour because Amazon recommend that you should stream for about an hour, but I'm not actually sure it makes any difference whatsoever. I have been slightly filibustering the time to keep it a bit longer.
I thoroughly enjoyed it as well, by the way.
Yeah. How can people find out about you? Presumably you've got books on Amazon. Have you got a website anywhere? Or
yes, all of my books are on Amazon. The zombie ones are on Kindle Unlimited, so you can actually download them and read them for free if you're a Prime member. I've got my website, which is danielparsonsbooks.com, which does encompass both of my pen names right now. I'm going through a whole branding exercise to try and change that. But yeah, it does encompass everything. And then other than that, one of the easiest places to contact me is if you tweet me at DK Parsons Writer. Because I'm generally quite active to responding to people. Not always posting myself, but I'll respond to people if they message me on Twitter.
Yeah. Okay. And Catherine has said, this has been great and I'm already stalking Dan. So expect
I thought I saw movement out the window. Yeah.
Somewhere in the US. So I don't think she's going to be sitting outside in a car with binoculars looking at you.
She wouldn't want to in Wales. It's very cold and wet.
Well, thanks for everybody who's been watching, and thanks so much, Dan, for being a guest. And I've got to try and work out which button to press to end the show. So,
and thank you very much for inviting me as well.
Yeah, thanks everybody.
Bye, everyone.